Kia ora koutou, thanks very much for having me. It's great to have such a good turnout, and I'm of course looking forward to the second presentation more than the first. So we talk a lot about the IDI both in New Zealand and internationally, so most of this I've worked through a number of times, but there's a couple of new slides and I'm going to make sure that I get numbers right in a couple of things, especially when I'm talking about research that Oranga Tamariki is doing. So here we go, let's get started with what the IDI is. So I think really the key things to say about the IDI is that it is linked data that is at the person level, so it's as granular as we can get it, and that it provides the ability to look at things longitudinally, so information across time. We have data from all across government included in there, so there's a lot of admin data, there's a lot of surveys, and in particular the census and social surveys from Stats NZ, and there is increasingly some NGO data in there as well. We update the IDI on a regular basis. That pattern is generally quarterly, although over the next 12 months it won't be quite as regular as normal. That's so we can get on with a bit more development work, but I can cover a bit of that at the end of the presentation. And so there is also, and there's a link at the bottom there, and we'll be able to share these slides, there is also on our website a full list of the data that's currently available in the IDI, and it's pretty extensive these days. Really this snazzy little picture just shows that the thing that is, well, one of the most valuable things about the IDI is it gives you ability to look across people's lifetimes at the interactions they have and different outcomes they experience, and be able to look at different relationships for how that works. So the IDI it's a person level data set. So the analysis is done at that level, but what comes out of the IDI is about characteristics of groups. So it's all de-identified and confidentialised and private when it comes out. And when I talk about how we keep the data safe, we'll talk more about that. This is probably, and that is actually spine, not the spin-E. I think that's what happens when you transfer between different systems. This is probably as technical as I'll get, but it's really nice to be able to explain to people that it just, the easiest way we can about how we put the IDI together. So we have a spine, which are the core linking data sets for the IDI. And so we have 3 data sets that make that up. There's the birth register from the Department of Internal Affairs. There's the tax number from Inland Revenue, and then there's also what we call visa information from MB. So that's about information about people coming in and out of the country. So with those 3 data sets linked together, we have greater than the population of New Zealand in our spine, obviously because people coming in and out. But that allows for us to be able to have pretty good coverage, so that we can link all the other data sets, and we refer to those as nodes to the spine. We've got 2 ways in which we do the linking. One is what you call deterministic, where we will do exact matches, and that's based on using unique identifiers that come from different parts of the system. So as we all know, there's not one number that links us all together in New Zealand, but for example, you have the National Health Indicator from the health system, or you have your IRD number for tax system and things like that. So we use those where we can. The second way in which we do linking is what you call probabilistic, and that is where we use personal identifiers, so name, sex, date of birth, and also increasingly address information to be able to do further linking and make more links. And clearly if we had one unique identifier, we wouldn't need to go to that level. And so what we do in terms of precision around the linking with the IDI, the easiest way to classify that is when we talk about false positives, so where we've made a link and it's not a true link. And so within the spine linking, so the 3 data sets in the top corner there, we keep that as close as we can to 1% false positives. With all the other data sets that link to the spine, that's at a 2% threshold. So you can see there's a wee bit of error that comes in, and that's due to the probabilistic linking, because the quality of the data is a bit variable. Excuse me. And so because the IDI is a data set where you're looking at the characteristics of groups, and that's what output and that's what's used, that threshold for a bit of error is acceptable. If you were using a linked data set to do case management, so to intervene in people's lives for good or because they're not doing things that fit the rules, you would need to have a look at your methodology again and make some pretty clear decisions about where those thresholds are acceptable or not, because there's some pretty real life implications for that. So that those thresholds and that level of accuracy are work for the context in which the IDI is used. So Gail Pachenko from Auckland is one of our long-standing IDI users, and when I in a second explain a bit of the history, and you'll see that the IDI is developed very much from a labour market focused tool, you'll see why, because that's where a lot of her work comes in. But really, Gail's actually great at providing us with some really handy quotes, and this one is really nice, where it talks about the point of difference and the greater links and the questions that are able to be answered that previously weren't when data was sitting in its different various silos. So the potential value there is pretty high. And this one here is just a nice example as well about how in New Zealand we've managed to do this. We're a pretty small country, and this is something that centrally in terms of government has had a lot of backing, and we've worked really hard at across the system, because although Stats NZ puts it together and is responsible for the service around providing access, we definitely can't do this without the data coming in and the suppliers and the use and the willingness of people to work with that. So we have a lot of interest internationally. So tends to be more around different states or territories in other countries. But if my team was constantly working through all the requests we get internationally, we'd be pretty busy with that rather than what the core job is. So that gives you a bit of an indication. Earlier this year, there was a D5 International Digital Showcase here in New Zealand, I think February. We were asked to be part of that. I think it's safe to say that we were a little bit nervous about that, because we were like, there's going to be some real whiz-bang digital things, and we kind of forget sometimes at actually the potential value and how useful this is. And so we went along, and those photos here, you can see that one there is our government statistician Liz McPherson talking, I think the delegation from Uruguay through different things, and they'd heard about us before they came along, so really keen. And then the other is Andrea Blackburn talking to, I think, the Chief Information Officer from Canada. So we were quite blown away with the interest people had in that. And it is definitely a theme that what we've managed to achieve in New Zealand is quite world leading. And so others are definitely looking to us. A bit of background now about the IDI and how it got started. It goes all the way back to the late 90s when Cabinet endorsed Stats New Zealand as the right place across government to be looking at data integration when data needed to be brought together from different agencies. And so we got on and we did that. The context and the environment and also the leadership at Stats at the time was very much one where you would put two data sets together and you would link them, and they would be sitting in their environment for the specific uses of that purpose and project that was put together for. And I guess one of the first really important big things that came out of that was in 2005 when the linking of employer and employee data was put together, and that's what we refer to as LEAD. And that LEAD database is really the foundation of where the IDI grew from. So with that, people will be starting to look at labour market type questions. Really quickly, there were questions about tertiary education and how that fed in, and so that information was linked. Questions about, well, if people aren't working, what's happening, might be on the benefits, so some benefit information. And then in 2011, the then Department of Labour received funding to have migration information included, and for at that point those somewhat siloed linking projects to be pulled together, so that all that integrated data could be used together, because a lot of the pull for the migration information at that point was looking at, well, actually a lot of people are overseas and what's happening, and just rounding out those questions people could look at even more. And that's really the point and where the prototype for the IDI came into being. And then really quickly after that point, we saw some pretty rapid change in the priorities and needs across government. In 2012, better public service measures were launched, and that very clearly needed more data sharing across government. There were some bigger, gnarlier questions. And in 2013, under the Analysis for Outcomes funding, the IDI was decided the IDI was the data sharing solution. And under Analysis for Outcomes, we worked in partnership with the Analytics and Insights team at Treasury. So we were the data sharing solution, and they provided the capability and then the know-how to use the data and what needed to go in and things like that as we expanded. So worked really hard and got a lot of stuff going across that in the few years afterwards. And it's very true to say that the growth in demand continues. This year, I think we've got double the amount of new projects coming into the IDI that we had this time last year, and we've grown in the last few years from 100 or 200 users to 750, and so a lot of that's exponential growth that we weren't necessarily prepared for in the timescale that we've had as well. So working through that, there's some pretty clear enabling factors that we have around that rapid growth and the success that we have had, and also enabling factors for why the data sharing solution would sit at stats and the IDI. And the first, although it's getting old and it is up for review, the Stats Act 1975 has been a good enabler, and it does provide really good guidance and outlines for how safe access to data and maintaining good processes there. And it meant, because we had the Stats Act, we already had a process in place for how access to unit record data was worked through. And the Stats Act also gives the government statistician a certain level of independence, which ties into the perception that stats is perhaps a safe pair of hands. We're not an operational agency. Our operation is making sure stuff's quality in terms of data, but we're not out intervening or working hands-on with the public in the same way. So that again can be quite helpful. Ministerial champions, I think, not to be underestimated in this context, and so. Definitely the Minister of Statistics, but if you look at the timeframes in which the rapid growth and expansion has happened, Bill English was the Minister of Finance as we were starting on that journey, and then became the Prime Minister, and he was particularly enthusiastic and influential, and also really hot on data getting in there. So when internationally people talk to us about how we've achieved things, we do talk really clearly about having good levers at the right levels as well. And definitely the environment around governance and emphasis on data sharing and evidence-based policy through the likes of better public services, Analysis for Outcomes and social investment was definitely pretty key enabling factors. And with the change in government and focus more on wellbeing, child poverty, and those pretty gnarly social questions that we're all dealing with, that emphasis hasn't really changed either. We're still growing. Social licence is also really important. I mentioned that stats is seen as somewhat independent, and there is a reasonable level of trust there with the public. That doesn't mean to say that we should be relaxed or take that for granted. So we work really hard at maintaining that, understanding what the pain points and thresholds are at given times and that sort of thing as well. Really important, how do we keep the data safe with the IDI? And privacy by design is something we take very seriously. And I think really important to mention that we're responsible for producing the IDI, and we're accountable for it, and we're the trustees for you, me, everybody in the room and in the country for this data. It is a national asset. We are not the owners. So we take our responsibilities around the accountability and trustee aspects really seriously. But but there's a difference between outright being the owner and having that role. And so the framework we use to keep the data safe is what's called the 5 safes. And it's not one that we necessarily built from scratch ourselves. We stole it from the UK, but have probably developed it a little bit more and differently and have it being used in slightly different ways. And so these 5 elements work together as a team. And in some ways the settings will be higher or lower depending on the context. The one that tends to be a little bit low all the time is the safe data, but I'll explain why. So the first is safe people. We do reference checks, researchers sign declarations of secrecy and undertakings for behaviour and the rest. We have ability to sanction behaviour that is outside of the rules. People can be banned or even prosecuted. We have not had to do that. We have a good trust relationship that we work on with the researchers. So safe people, we're really clear that we understand who is getting in and using the data. Safe projects is also really important. So the data has to be used for statistical research purposes, and there has to be a public interest element to the work that people are doing. And so all projects are assessed on a case-by-case basis. We are currently working through how we can change that process to make it more transparent and a bit more timely, because it can be a little bit cumbersome for researchers, so we're finding a good balance there. All decisions around access are made by the government statistician or a delegated person, and so actually 9 times out of 10 that falls to my role at the moment. And so we work through that really carefully. Safe settings, we ultimately supply the safe setting in that the IDI is run through a virtual private network, so we take care of all the security and things. People cannot email when they're in the IDI off the terminal, they can't print, and there are rules around the places in which you access the IDI. So we have some 30 remote data labs around the country and 3 in our Stats New Zealand offices, and there are quite strict physical requirements for how those data labs have to be set up. Safe data, that refers to the data itself. So when the researchers are in data labs working within the virtual private network, they are using de-identified data. So that's data where names, days of date of birth and exact addresses have been removed, and any unique identifier has been encrypted. So that data is not confidential at that point, but there's a very good reason for why that is. 1, the safe data works alongside the other 4 safes to ensure the right environment. 2, researchers need the ability to be able to really get in and use the data to get the best insights they can. And 3, safe data works really closely with safe outputs, where before any outputs are released from the virtual private network or the data lab environment, the confidentiality rules, which we stipulate, and they're all available on our website, need to be applied to the data, and we make checks to make sure that they've been applied appropriately. So before any data leaves our environment, it is confidentialised to protect privacy. I won't talk through all the points on this, except for to say I think the key point is, if people are wanting to use the IDI, the best thing to do is come and have a chat to us before you put an application in. There are a few things that would be a red light, and they're things you'd expect around case management or some pretty complex legislative issues, meaning that the data can't be shared or used in that way, research for regulatory purposes, things like that. There are a number of things that might fall into the sort of you need to check this with us category, and we come up, we have those conversations frequently and work that through with researchers, and then you've clearly got your green light category. So it's really, really uncommon that a project is just straight out red and it won't move through. There's conversations and that we have with people to help understand why the rules are that way. It's not bureaucratic for the sake of it. There's really good protections in place for really solid reasons. I mentioned social licence earlier, and it's really important for us what the public thinks. There's a couple of pieces of research that we have had done, one around the public's attitudes to data integration that we contracted Opus International to do. And that showed quite clearly there was some clear settings and processes and values that were really important to people. And the IDI and the processes we have fit nicely into that at different levels of the spectrum, but we were largely in step. And then some further work that was done in conjunction with University of Auckland and funded by the Data Futures Partnership actually showed that yes, that's right, and people actually have a baseline level of expectation that data will be used in different ways and that should be used for good. But the further step with this one was that most of the public still don't have good visibility of the IDI. And you know, there's many reasons for that, but that's really good for us to understand more about that, more about what our messaging needs to look like, how we put things out there. And so that's constantly something that we're working on. And checking social license is something that we need to do regularly as well. You don't kind of just check it once and go, okay, we're good. Because context changes, different things are happening in the environment and the rest of it. So this is a definition that the second piece of work I talked about came up with around social license. So basically we're saying here that, you know, there are different norms. Norms will dictate what's sort of okay in terms of prohibited types of actions, and that's where your social license comes from. In terms of the way the IDI is being used, I've got just a few examples in here that we could probably talk for half an hour about this, and then I wouldn't be the best person to do it either. It would be better to get the people up who actually do the research, which is why I'm looking forward to the second presentation. Nonetheless, I'll give you a bit of an overview, and really that slide's just saying there's lots of things. And I think the key point in this slide, because there's lots of scientific methodological words in there, is that key uses of the IDI at the moment are not driving new methodological ways or statistical ways of doing things, but because the data is sort of fundamentally for the first time being pulled together in one place, people are able to apply the statistical and analytical practices they've been using for a while in quite a different setting, and to really hone their skills and answer questions they hadn't been able to before. And so there's really three major ways in which the IDI is currently being used. Evaluations and quasi-experiments, so, you know, as opposed to a true experiment where you might have an intervention and a control, and that's allocated in a very non-random way. The quasi-experiment works through how you can nut that out, and propensity score matching is quite often used. Micro-simulations are increasingly being used in the IDI, and we have a number now, and Oranga Tamariki is one of those. So you guys have got a pretty hefty one going, and there are more coming. And then profiling of subpopulations, which is funny because it sounds intense the way that's written, but that's actually your basic statistical work around counts and averages and things like that. And I think probably I would add also that there is research into statistics that goes on in the IDI as well, and obviously Stats New Zealand does a lot about that, and that's about how might we be able to use admin data more than surveys, and what are different ways that we can do that and things. So the key message there really is that having the data in one place like this allows people to be able to test the methods they've been using with different types of research questions. So this example, outcomes of tertiary study that Ministry of Education and TEC work on, is probably an oldie but a goodie, I think is the best way to describe it. And so this is a really nice example of where your integrated data can be used in real life. And so they look at the outcomes of tertiary education, and on the Careers New Zealand website there's the ability to be able to compare different degrees and have a look at what you might be earning 1, 2 and 5 years out from study, whether you might be in the country, how likely you are to be employed and things. Social Investment Agency have focused on investing for social wellbeing, and in this example they were looking at the impact of social housing on people's lives, and you can see that there was some good positive impact for that. They were originally looking at a full return on investment, but the quality of the data that was available didn't really allow for that. But nonetheless, you can see there's less time in prison, more time in school, and able to access better support. This is a really nice example, very current, looking at exploring the gender pay gap, and in particular this piece of research was looking at the impact on wages for women. It showed that the main finding was that hourly wage difference was 5.7% between similar men and women without children, but 12.5% between men and women who were parents, with high income women being the most affected. And so what's really cool about this also is that the researchers teamed up with the Ministry for Women. The Ministry for Women have produced a booklet that provides practical advice for employers about how they can use the benefits of this research to think about that in their own work setting, and so the researchers have been working in conjunction with them, and so Gail Pachenko, who we talked about earlier, goes out and talks about the research, and the Ministry for Women go through with her and talk about the booklet. So that's been a really nice example. This one is a little awkward for me to talk about because this is Oranga Tamariki's work, so there'll be plenty of people in the room that probably know much more about it than me, but a really nice example here. And so the big curve represents the real numbers of children that the data is used to measure whether they're in need or not. So the blue in not apparently in need, moving through to the orange where there's a high level of need. And Oranga Tamariki is probably intervening in some way. The 5 measures at the bottom is the domains of wellbeing is how this is measured. And I think it's really important to say here too, and we often have this in a slide, is that the IDI was used in this, an important part, not the only part, but in part in the establishment of Oranga Tamariki as well, and that was off the back of some work that the Analytics and Insights team at Treasury had done, looking at the key risk factors for children at high risk of poor outcomes. NGOs and iwi. So I mentioned we've started to get some NGO data coming into the IDI, and the IDI has, due to the complexity of the data and the way it's developed, a pretty high baseline threshold for analytical expertise to get in and be able to use it, and that's one of the realities of where it's at right now, and clearly that is a barrier for different groups, and so we need to do some more work with iwi and NGO groups, but also with our partners across government to be able to decrease some of those barriers, and so that's not a nut we've cracked at this stage, but are working on it. And I think the other important thing to mention there is that we are looking at better ways to be able to make sure that there are cultural perspectives included in how access to data is considered. So I talked about the 5 safes that we use, and we are working with various people and groups to be able to provide a cultural lens across the 5 safes, rather than adding in a cultural safe, but actually embedding those values and principles within our access protocols as well. So we're really excited about that. What have we learned? Benefits and limitations. This is just some, and I think that probably in the blue box it would also be good to mention that it's pretty difficult to get the IDI out these days as well, and it's not as timely as it could be. It can take a while to get new data in. And so we have a development project in play where we're looking to address some of that as well. And if I've got time, I'll whip through a couple of slides on that. There's some pretty clear lessons we've learned. You've got to be really aware of your enabling factors and grab the opportunities when they come. And that's really important. If you build it, they will come, and that's true. So in hindsight, we probably weren't as prepared for a lot of that as what we should have been or could have been, and that's meant that some of our processes and policies probably haven't evolved at the same rate as use, or we perhaps didn't anticipate some of the maturing demands on what people would want to do with the data. So we are working on that now. Data providers are generally willing to make their data available, understandably, There are a lot of questions that come up, and we need to work through that with people. And we need to be really transparent about what our processes are, what the protections are we have, and how we work through a privacy impact assessment, and how that is done before data goes anywhere near our system and things like that. So we've learned a lot about how you work through that. Technical skills are a barrier to extracting value, and that I've touched on, and so we will continue to work on that. We had some early issues with system access and capacity. I wouldn't say they've necessarily all gone away, but we understand what they are a lot better now. You must always check in on your social licence, and not do things in a vacuum. And really the key goal for us is to move from a naive sense of trust to a more informed sense of trust. We feel we'll have a much more stable foundation if we can move to that, and so that's something we're constantly working on as well. Flexibility is key. I mean, that probably, if you've got 750 people and some of that is, entire teams working to budget cycles and things relying on you, you need to work some of that out. I mentioned that we're developing at the moment, and that's really imaginatively called IDI 2. And so because of the way the IDI has taken off and grown, and I often liken it to the fact that we've just kept building more stories onto our skyscraper, and where we're at now is that we actually need more of a city infrastructure and some arterial routes, and to be able to be more sustainable and scalable and responsive. And so we've been out and we've talked to customers, and that list there gives you some idea of the things that are still difficult and tricky for people. So it's not all about technology. There's also about, I need to be able to interact and have a better network. I need more metadata, and I need the metadata really close to the data. Some really practical things as well. I need to be able to work iteratively and at pace, and sometimes your processes just really get in the way of that. How can we find a good balance? And a data issue, as opposed to just an IDI issue, that the quality of data isn't always well understood, or it makes it difficult to work with, or I'm not sure if I'm putting the right assumptions out here and things like that. So, but because of the nature of the IDI, those things become really apparent really quickly. So we are looking to redesign, and we've started at the high level with a cross-government and wider working group, and we've done that based on workshops and then sort of sprints in between. And some of the emerging direction is, the emerging direction is needing to ensure that we're stable and flexible on our platform to enable growth. And the two sort of key value streams that will be a focus will be enabling the research and insights to be done better, so the people who are already in there and making their life better, and more focus and more deliberate work around partnership. So I think, we've been running to keep up so much, we've probably missed some opportunities for where we could do that more, and that's both with people using the data, people wanting to use the data, people producing different products off the data and the likes. So the idea is that by making life better for the people who are in there already, then the value will flow a bit wider again, so that for the people who it's actually really a high barrier to even get in there, there'll be more coming out, and the two-way flow will hopefully be able to work more. So where we're getting to now is going to be working more with, we have a technical lead group, and working more with them around detail, what it is that's the requirements really for what you need on a daily basis when you're going in and using this and that sort of thing, and then making decisions about how you update the IDI in future going through with that. So sorry, I had to rush at the end a bit there, but I don't know, we probably haven't got time for questions now, we'll do it at the end. Yeah, cool.